Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Piss. I don't know what this video is going to be right now. It's a kind of an extra video, giving you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine, but it's not really, it's about psychology. Now, I mentioned something in a video this morning called the Just World Theory, and I said that people didn't quite understand what I was trying to say. I was talking about how we intuitively have a belief that the world is fair. What I didn't say is that we all think the world is fair. And lots of people pile on saying, obviously the world isn't fair. What are you talking about? Blah, 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 blah. No. What I was talking about is that there is this intuitive, almost desire that the world should be fair in human psychology, to the point where it really triggers us when it isn't fair. And that's what triggered me with regard to the Ukraine war, is that it was so obviously unfair that my sense of justice and fairness was compromised. Now, what my claim was this morning is that that intuitive sense of fairness can impact the way that we understand the world in several different manners, but it is a thing. And this thing has been formalized into a theory called the Just World Theory, or the Just World Hypothesis. So you can jump on me or disagree with me all you like, but this is a pretty formalized theory in psychology. And in fact, it underwrites what most people on Earth believe. And let me explain myself there. So while we might agree that when we look at the world, it seems deeply unfair and stuff happens that is just self-evidently incredibly lacking in justice. And we can look at that in terms of disease, natural disasters, or we can look at that in terms of man-made things like war and murder and crime, etc., etc. Now, one way to explain what I'm going to be talking about comes out of an anecdote of mine that I turned into an article sometime back for Only Sky, and the article is called Just World Theory in Oven Doors. And I remember we'd just bought this house, actually, a new house it was new for us back, I don't know, 10 years ago, and it's got a fairly large-ish kitchen compared to what we used to have. And our twin boys at the time was sort of 3, and they were whizzing up and down the kitchen on one of these rolly chairs, like an office chair. I don't know where they got it from, but an office stool, right? And one of the twins sent the other twin careering down the kitchen and smashed into this big range oven and smashed the main oven door. And we're like, oh my God, this is a new house. That came with a house. And that's a big old range cooker. That's not cheap. Looked online and it was like, they don't make them anymore. You're going to have to buy a new range cooker for like 1,300 quid. And we're like, no. Eventually, after like 2 days of searching the internet, I found a secondhand one somewhere. But what was interesting then is my partner, who used to be religious, isn't religious anymore, all that time spent with me, I guess, said, oh my God, that just had to happen for a reason. So maybe that oven was going to burn the house down in like 2 weeks, blah, 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 blah. And so therefore that was meant to happen. And so she couched what had happened there. She couldn't have that just like shit happens. Oh my goodness, that's a really bad result and we're going to have to buy a new oven. It's like that bad thing has to be balanced by a good thing. And therefore, even though I don't kind of believe this kind of stuff and karma and gods or whatever, like that had to have happened for a reason. So it's that bad is balanced by justifying good. And that was her natural go-to. She didn't kind of realize she was doing that. And I was like, oh my goodness, that is just a perfect expression of the Just World Theory. So the Just World Theory is actually what underwrites most people's belief in heaven and hell, though they might not kind of realize it if they believe in that. Indeed, karma as a belief is an iteration of manifestation of the Just World Hypothesis. And though we might look at the world and say it is unfair, we have this urge in us, this intuitive urge in us quite often to see something that seems really unfair and try and couch that in a way that it must be balanced by another action or aspect of reality, so that that bad thing is all right because that good thing, and they are connected somehow. Now, although I don't, I'm a skeptic, I'm an atheist philosopher, and I'm not having a go at religion here, but what I'm going to do is explain some religious beliefs. And this will track back to our understanding of geopolitics later, but we're having a bit of a sidebar here today. If you look at, say, the Bible, and I know that there are many other holy books, you look at the Bible, and that's made up of the Hebrew Bible, which is the Old Testament, which is what Jews believe, and then the New Testament, which is the add-on to do with Jesus, and a belief that came to be that Jesus was God incarnate in human form. Jews don't believe that. Christians do believe that. What's interesting is in the Old Testament, there's no real coherent belief of the afterlife or the eternal soul. It's like you die, that's it. We can talk about some elements in there maybe, and there was a bit of a development. But in the intertestamental period, the bit between the Old Testament and New Testament, you had the development of the afterlife and heaven and hell. Or they started coming along because you had the Seleucid Empire at the time, which had these Hellenized Jews, which means Greekized Jews. So it had a lot of influence from Greek thinking, Tartarus and Elysian Fields and blah, blah, blah. Ideas of heaven and hell and souls and afterlife and that kind of thing. Now you had the Orthodox Jews in the region were being persecuted by the Hellenized Jews. And they were going, hang on, we are the chosen ones. So if we're the chosen ones, we're like the AOK guys. How come we're being oppressed? How come in this here life, which is the only life we have, we're getting done over? And so then you started getting this development of the idea like, well, that's deeply unfair. And life can't be unfair, especially if we believe in a God and that God is fair. Like we don't believe in a God who is inherently unfair. So therefore, this needs to be balanced in some way. And so you started getting the development of like, right, if life is crap, it needs to be balanced so that everything is fair with an afterlife that is not crap, that balances the crapness. So it's okay if all terrible things happen to us on earth because we get to go to heaven and lovely things happen to us. And likewise, with all the bad people that do all the bad stuff, if they get away with doing bad stuff on earth and it's all okay for them, how can they get away with persecuting others and doing those horrible things if that's not balanced? So then in the afterlife, when they die, they go to hell. Right now we get some sort of balancing, except there are huge problems with those digital ideas of, all people, all spectrum of people going into like the good bucket or the bad bucket. Anyway, I'm not here to, I've written a book on that and whatever. I'm not here to denigrate the ideas of heaven and hell, just to explain how they work in line with human psychology, which is we have this desire that things are fair, and in reality they're not fair, and so we create mechanisms in life that artificially give us a sense of fairness, and that is heaven and hell, or it's karma. Right, you've done something bad, it'll come back and bite you. The universe is created and is not created. The universe exists in such a way that you will get your comeuppance, right? Things happen for a reason. All of these ideas are a way that our human psychology balances things to give a sense of justice, yin and yang. Now, unfortunately, that's not how reality works. Okay, if you believe in heaven and hell, then obviously for you, that is how reality works. But even so, it's not how reality works on Earth. So my position is that bad things happen on Earth, and we need to fight really hard to make sure that they don't happen, or mitigate against them happening, or hold people account for them happening, because they won't get their comeuppance in an afterlife. It's all about human problems being solved by human beings. So when we look at what Vladimir Putin is doing, it triggers my sense of injustice massively. It's why 2 years after this war, I'm still banging on to you, because it enrages me that it is so unfair. And we can just let that go, and we can say life is crap, life is unfair, let's just get on with it, and we'll just live over here in our own little existence here and just hope that it doesn't affect us. But of course, that is, the golden rule that pre-existed Christianity. Confucius talked about this in 500 years before Christianity, or before the 500 BC, I think, which is the golden rule, which is do unto others as you'd have done unto you. And you can improve that to the platinum rule, and etc. etc. You can go and research the platinum rule. But the idea is that if I sit over here, like, if I was being persecuted, would I like other people to sit over in their little corner not helping out? No. Okay, so this principle of not wanting to be selfish, of helping out others, because I wouldn't like to be that person being persecuted or oppressed, and have other people look on. I am going to try and change things, and also I want the world to be a better place. I want my children to grow up in a world of fairness, in a world that isn't destroyed by autocracy and war and environmental degradation. So we need to look after the world in all the ways that we can, to pass it on to our children. And that is what is, I think, important about looking at geopolitics, looking at politics in general, about our policies that our countries have. It's about, so for me, it's interesting because it gets onto ideas of individualism and collectivism and whatnot. It's very easy, I think, to vote for a political party that is going to benefit you, and you particularly. And I think a lot of people do that. They say, right, I'm going to vote in the party that's going to give me a tax break, because literally I am going to be better off by voting in that political party. I'm not like that. I will vote in a party that might make me slightly worse off. I'm not trying to say, oh, look at me, how wonderful. This is just how my mind works. I'm more likely to vote for a party that I think will make my society a better place to live for all of us. And that will do things that I think is important. So, environmental policy is important to me. It turns out that now, with this war, defense policy is important to me. And that's something I never would have thought would have been so important to me personally. And that's what happens when you live in this era of peace dividend, when we haven't been at war for whatever reason, and so you're thinking, oh yeah, we don't need to spend on defense because it's not clearly not that important. We're important. We all live in a time when we've got past imperialism, and then along comes Putin, and lo and behold, imperialism is back on the menu. But anyway, I just wanted to have a little look at this just world theory as well. So I'll read to you the wiki entry here, just a little bit of it at the beginning. So the just world hypothesis, or just world theory, is a cognitive bias that assumes that people will get what they deserve, that actions will necessarily have morally fair and fitting consequences for the actor. For example, the assumptions that noble actions will eventually be rewarded and evil actions will eventually be punished fall under this hypothesis. In other words, the just world hypothesis is a tendency, remember that's why I say it's a tendency, it's like an intuition, to attribute consequences to, or expect consequences as a result of, either a universal force that restores moral balance or a universal connection between the nature of actions and their results. The belief generally implies the existence of cosmic justice, destiny, divine providence, desert, just deserts, stability, order, or the Anglophone colloquial use of karma, as it is often associated with a variety of fundamental fallacies, especially in regard or with regard to rationalizing suffering on the grounds that the sufferers deserve it. And so this is kind of where I said I'll bring this back to Ukraine, and I knew it would somehow, but I haven't planned this as a stream of consciousness, but this is exactly right. This is exactly right to bring this back to Ukraine here, because the way that people in Russia, or people defending what Russia are doing, will justify the horrors that they see. So your brain will, I've talked about cognitive dissonance reduction so many times before, but the idea is you have a core belief. And when you are met with evidence, rational evidence against that core belief, it comes into a contact such that there is dissonance. There is disharmony in your mind between the core belief and the evidence against it. So what do? You will have loads of heuristics and mental gymnastics that you will do that will generally keep the core belief in place. And generally you will do something to minimize the evidence against it. Sometimes you just bury your head in the sand and compartmentalize it and just pretend that evidence just doesn't exist. People do that. Or you adapt the evidence to fit your core belief. So that's something that happens. Or you do things like shoot the messenger. So you say, oh, that evidence is rubbish because the person that told me that evidence is like morally horrible, and so therefore I don't need to take on the substance of what they're saying. I'm going to dismiss it by associating it, guilt by association, poisoning the well, all these kind of fallacies to get rid of that evidence. All these different ways to minimize the evidence and keep your core belief. So then let's track this back to what's going on with Russians, for example, with regard to the Ukraine war. So Russians then see evidence that their Russian troops have committed war crimes, that they are sending missiles into Ukraine and they are killing civilians. All these terrible things. There will be cognitive dissonance going on because their core belief is that Russia is good, Russia is right. And this is a sense of justice, right? So Russia is awesome. I love Russia because Russia is part of my identity. I'm a Russian. It is part of my identity. And so therefore, everything that Russia does is by extension something that I'm doing, even though I'm not fighting on the fields of Ukraine. There are people fighting on my behalf. They're fighting for Russia, and Russia is part of my identity, so they are fighting for me. And so therefore, they can do no wrong, because if they do wrong, if I accept that they're doing wrong, then I'm accepting that part of me is wrong, that part of my agency is morally malignant, and I can't have that. That means that my whole sense of identity will start falling apart. And so to keep that core belief sturdy, I have to do something with that evidence, which is that, and this comes back to the idea of just desserts, which is we've done seemingly horrible things to the Ukrainians, but actually it's not seemingly horrible. It's a bit like the death penalty. These people have done horrible, that murderer has done terrible things, and I think it's okay to kill them if they've done terrible things. And that kind of balances. Personally, I don't go with the death penalty, but that's a whole other discussion. This is kind of how they think, which is that the Ukrainians must deserve it. If we've done something horrible to the Ukrainians, then it must be that they deserve it. They are getting their just desserts. This is karma. You are Nazis. You are Ukro-Nazis. You are terrible fascists. You have done horrible things. Oh, look what you've done in the Donbass since 28-14, like ignoring or not knowing about all the stuff that the Russians have done. And then that justify, right, I can keep my core belief, and that evidence that we're doing terrible things has been adapted to my core belief so that these aren't terrible things, they are deserving things. And I've morphed the evidence to fit my core belief, but the core belief remains. And I think that's certainly an element, or it's connected to just world, where the just world is your world. My world is my Russian world, where Russia is part of me and I am part of Russia. Anyway, it's just interesting that I think I think this whole moral psychological theory has a lot of purchase for me, certainly. Hypothesis popularly appears in the English language in various figures of speech that imply guaranteed punishment for wrongdoing, such as you got what was coming to you, what goes around comes around, chickens come home to roost, everything happens for a reason. I said that earlier. You reap what you sow. The hypothesis has been widely studied by social psychologists since Melvin Lerner conducted seminal work on the belief in a just world in the early 1960s. Researchers continue since then examining the predictive capacity of the hypothesis in the various situations and across cultures, and clarifying and expanding the theoretical understandings of just world beliefs. Okay, so it talks about that, it talks about the theory, and then alternative versions thereof. But some additional evidence, I think this is quite interesting. After his first studies, other researchers replicated these findings in other settings in which individuals are victimized. This work, which began in the 1970s and continues today, has investigated how observers react to victims of random calamities like traffic accidents, as well as rape and domestic violence, illnesses and poverty. Generally, researchers have found that observers of the suffering of innocent victims tend to both derogate and blame victims for their suffering. Observers thus maintain their belief in a just world by changing their cognitions about their victim's character. This is exactly what it's just telling you with regard to Ukrainians. They deserve that. This is a really common trope that is left over from Victorian thinking. So Victorian thinking used to be that poor people deserve to be poor, rather than that poverty was kind of a situation they were born into and had no control over. It's like, how do we understand poverty if I think that there's a just world, and especially if I believe that there's God and God is all loving, and therefore everything that God creates must be all loving, and so therefore all the suffering must be, oh goodness, it's humans' fault, even though you're ultimately responsible for that. Anyway, I won't get onto that. I've written books on that, but it's the idea that, okay, so therefore if bad things are happening to you, like poverty, it's your fault. If you don't have a job, it's because you're lazy. You are poor because you're lazy. That's the thinking that came out of Victorian times that still persists today. And it's really, really prevalent in a lot of politics that goes on now, which is attacking those on welfare. You deserve it. You're lazy, blah, 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 rather than understanding that they are who they are because of the genetics they've been born with and the environment that they've been born into. And that explains their behavior now, and it's the same with all of us. It's just that when you have a privileged outlook looking down, you don't say, look at your own self and analyze why you are who you are and doing what you're doing. My first book was on whether we have libertarian free will. I need to rewrite it. It's a good, fair enough book, but it could be better written. My writing has improved a lot since then. That's like 2011. Yeah, so you need to understand that we are who we are because of the situations we're in and the interaction of our environment with our biology and our genes, and that produces who we are and what we do. But it's very easy to look at a whole subset of people, and this is why I always question about when we look at Russians. Say Russians are like this, and say Ukrainians are like this. I always say, I feel a little bit uncomfortable doing that. I think there is definitely an element of cultural learning, and you have a culture that is reinforced quite often by sort of like people being together over time, and then through governments and states and whatever. You can get a situation where peoples are more likely to tend toward some given behavior than and other peoples. But of course that is a simplification, and it's not like everyone is going to do that. So you look at Russia and you think, oh, all Russians are like this. They love autocracies, and they love just giving their power to dictators, and they lie, and they do corruption, forgetting the fact that that anyone that doesn't want that ends up in a gulag or ends up in prison. And there are plenty of people who don't want that kind of system and don't want that kind of politics. But at the beginning of the war, you probably forget, like at the beginning of the war, a lot of people went out on the streets and properly protested against the war, but they all got rounded up. All the TV stations got shut down, and they got sent to prison, or those who thought, right, I don't want to go to prison, they left the country. And then you're left with a distilled version of that which you don't like. And that's why Putin's like, yeah, go for it, guys, because we don't want you here, because I can't control you guys as much as I can control what's left. So he'd much rather people left the country who would create problems for him. Anyway, I digress. In the early 70s, social psychologists Zick Rubin and Letitia Ann Perplau developed a measure of belief in a just world. The measure and its revised form, published in 1975, allowed the study of individual differences in just world beliefs. Much of the subsequent research into just world hypothesis used these measurement scales. These studies on victims of violence and illness and poverty and others like them have provided consistent support for the link between observers' just world beliefs and their tendency to blame victims for their suffering. As a result, the existence of the just world hypothesis as a psychological phenomenon has become widely accepted. So when I talked about it this morning, I wasn't just pulling something out of my posterior. This is a widely accepted and evidenced psychological theory that has measurement scales and has been replicated. So, you can argue against it, but bring the receipts and whatnot. Interesting. So I always like correlates and things like this. Correlation doesn't mean causation, but there will be things going on, no doubt here. So researchers have used measures of belief in the just world to look at correlates of high and low levels of belief in the just world. Limited studies have examined ideological correlates of the belief in a just world. These studies have found socio-political correlates of just world beliefs, including right-wing authoritarianism and Protestant work ethic. Really interesting. But Yeah, right-wing authoritarianism. I wonder if there's also that belief in religiosity that's associated sometimes with right-wing authoritarianism as well. As it goes on to say, studies have also found belief in a just world to be correlated with aspects of religiousness. That's entirely obvious to me, because I think it's a belief in just world theory that gave rise to the belief in heaven and hell and the afterlife. And in order to have the belief in heaven and hell and the afterlife, you have to have a vehicle with which to do that, which is why the soul got invented. And the soul allows you access to heaven and hell. So if you don't have some kind of eternal connection to your earthly body, or manifestation of your earthly body, then you can't have heaven and hell. So that's why the soul got invented. Soul is a thoroughly problematic idea. I've done a whole video. I've done interviews on the soul. I've written chapters on the soul in books. Anyway, people like it as an idea. You hear the term used all the time, but actually, it's insanely problematic as an idea, philosophically speaking. The development of measures of just world beliefs have also allowed researchers to assess cross-cultural differences in just world beliefs. Much research conducted shows that beliefs in the just world are evident cross-culturally. One study tested beliefs in the just world of students in 12 countries. This study found that in countries where the majority of inhabitants are powerless, belief in the just world tends to be weaker than in other countries. This supports the theory of the just world hypothesis because the powerless have had more personal and societal experience that provided evidence that the world is not just and predictable. It's a really interesting point. So in a world where, I don't know, if you are born into poverty and you've got no way of getting out of poverty, and you like, I don't have the skills, I don't have the education, I don't have a job, I'm malnourished, like, there's no way out of this, I'm stuck here, then your belief that the world is just, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. And that's why you will find in those sort of situations, religiosity thrives. So, goodness, I wasn't expecting to go on all these places, but this may or may not be of interest to you. It's really interesting when you look at where is religiosity most prevalent around the world. And religiosity is the least prevalent in places like the Nordic states. So the Nordic, like Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, have the least amount of religiosity, but they also have the highest happiness ratings, interestingly, social welfare, security, all sorts of stuff. What's going on there is that when you have existential security, so in other words, I have a job. If I lose my job, it's all right. The welfare state will pick me up and help me to get another job, and I'll be all right. I won't lose my house. Interestingly, places like the US, you don't have that. There isn't a welfare state that's as supportive in the US, but certainly many countries around the world, you lose your job, you can lose your house, you lose like your ability to feed your family, right? So you're only, as my partner used to say, you're only one car crash away from losing your house, type thing. You know, it is a real issue. So what that means in the Nordic states is that you have existential security, you have good education, you have good healthcare systems, you have all this stuff that helps you as a human being to flourish, which means functionally you don't have the need for a god in your life as much as elsewhere, because you don't get this sense of an unjust world, because actually the state does a really good job of creating a sense of justice and also picking you up when you fall down. You take that away, it's no surprise that in the most war-torn countries and the poorest countries, religiosity is the highest. The one anomaly here is the United States. The United States is a really interesting anomaly in terms of the demographics of religion, because there you have a whole mix of all sorts of stuff. So you have good education, you've got a good GDP, but actually you've got a pretty poor welfare state, and you lower down the happiness levels. And actually, although there's a high mean average of GDP per capita. So in other words, it seems like everyone's quite rich throughout the country. You've got a lot of rich people and a lot of poor people. There's a real disparity between so the rich and the poor that doesn't exist in the Nordic states. And you've got regulation to say that CEOs can't earn more than X times the amount of the worker in some of the Nordic states. I think they've got some of those rules. The gap between rich and poor is much more like that In the US, it's like that, and therefore you have a real variety in terms of poverty and education and aspiration and all sorts of stuff. That means it's a right mix, and actually some areas of the US are fervent grounds for religiosity, but you still get some of those demographic correlates, like, for example, the more educated you are, less likely you are to be religious, and so on and so forth. No, it is interesting among different demographics. I don't want to go down that route. I wasn't expecting to go there, but the point is that the more war torn your country is, and the more you feel powerless, the more likely you are to tend to either the world is just unfair, shit happens, oh my god, because look at the situation I'm in, and I'm powerless to do anything about it, so therefore it must be unfair. Or you go, the only way I can explain this is a fervent belief in God, because then all of this gets balanced when I die in heaven, and that keeps me going. So you can see functional benefits. I talk about how God exists. Like, I don't believe God exists from a philosophical point of view, but I believe God exists functionally for so many people, that God provides a function. So if we move to a post-God society, then you have to understand what the functions that God does for people in society, because you will probably need to replace most of those things with something else. So, for example, if people go to church every Sunday and sit with like-minded people and sing hymns and have that sense of togetherness and have that social networking, then if you're going to get rid of that, how are you going to? These people are going to still have those needs. So we need to think about how to replace sense of community, sense of purpose, sense of etc., etc., etc. So yeah. Anyway, again, I digress. Hopefully, you understand that just world theory can sort of seep its way into many aspects of reality here, and I find that deeply fascinating. Okay, I was just finishing here. Belief in unjust world has been linked to increase in self-handicapping, criminality, defensive coping, anger, and perceived future risk. It may also serve as ego-protective belief for certain individuals of justifying maladaptive behavior. And this is where you get into the psychology of religion and demographics of religion, and say, okay, so if religion offers you this sense of justice in the world, then actually there might be some corollary benefits to that, which means that those people are less likely towards criminality. So it's not like people often say they do statistics really badly, or they do sociology really badly, and they look at, say, religious people and say, oh look, these people are more likely to do this, therefore belief in God makes you more likely to be like this. It's no. This is the correlation causation fallacy. We need to see what the functions of belief that are going on here, or what else is going on. So it could be that you're not happy if you believe in God. It's you're happy if you go to church and are surrounded by like-minded people, and you're doing things with them and getting that sense of community. Like the actual belief in God, like the abstract idea of the existence of God, or the theology there, doesn't do the heavy lifting for all these other elements of religious belief. So we need to understand that there's psychology going on here. This is why the psychology of religion is so fascinating, and then that has impact on moral behavior as well. But it's not like belief in God is what's doing the heavy lifting for, say, moral behavior or this kind of behavior or whatever over here. There's an absolutely tremendous book called The Non-Religious, which I have up there. I won't get it for you down, by Luke Galen, Pasquale, and Zuckerberg. I've done an interview of Phil Zuckerberg on my other channel, but really interesting that actually how we look at people around the world and understand their behaviors in terms of their backgrounds and their beliefs, and what's really going on, and what is the psychology that's going on underneath the bonnet. Anyway, I will digress no more into the world of religion, because you probably won't appreciate that so much. I'll leave that for my other channel, although that's gathering cobwebs at the moment. I just wanted to kind of defend myself, because lots of people were saying, yeah, of course the world's unfair. What are you talking about? You don't know what you're talking about, type thing. And it's like, yeah, I kind of do know what I'm talking about here, to at least some degree. I just thought I'd share that with you. And also, it does give us some idea of how to approach understanding how people deal with something like the war in Ukraine, whether you be sitting in a study in the south coast of England, like myself, or whether you are a Russian looking at your boys doing what they're doing in Ukraine. How do we understand this data that is coming to us in terms of how we interpret reality and how we understand who we are and how the world is, and how I guess our I guess understanding of politics, because as I said earlier, so often we see our nation as an extension of ourselves, and therefore our political parties often as an extension of ourselves, especially if we vote for that party. And the problem, then you get really interesting psychology whereby, so say that you really hate the Democrats and therefore you hate Joe Biden. And even though Joe Biden is a pretty nice, decent chap, right, you can't have that because you're dyed-in-the-wool Republican. So you look at Joe Biden and say, he's a horrible human being. And so therefore, anything that the US does is horrible because actually that isn't me. That's not representing me. The US, I have my sense of what the US is, and it's this, and it's not what the Democrats are. And so therefore, anything that Biden does is by extension wrong because I simplify things and put things into unnuanced categories of good and bad, and that's it. And so therefore, if Joe Biden is in support of Ukraine, that must be wrong. And so that, I'm not, obviously this is not all Republicans, there's a big split in the Republican Party, so people can overcome that, but there is that desire in people to want to see Biden as the bad guy or doing badly, or almost want to see him fail because you want your guy to do the best. It's exactly the same with me and say Trump. You know, there will be that desire for me to see Trump fail, you know, even when he was in charge of the US, and I want the US to succeed. It's this idea that surely you want your country to succeed. Actually, if the wrong party's in charge, you want your country to fail so that those guys get the comeuppance, and then your guy gets voted in, and then yay, we're back to the alignment of my sense of nation and politics aligning to my sense of self. Just me, stream of consciousness, banging on about that endlessly, so I better stop. Anyway, let me know what you think. This is no particularly effective ending to this. I'm like, yeah, I better stop talking now. Let me know what you think. If you disagree, let me know why you disagree. And if you agree, what else do you think you can glean from this, and where can you take it? What other contexts can this be applicable in? Anyway, take care and speak to you soon. I am off to the pub tonight for a TP's, Tippling Philosophers, where we get together and we talk about stuff like this. This is, in fact, I might, because we haven't got an arranged subject to talk about tonight, which is often we do. I think we might talk about just world theory. So there you go. That's one for the pub. Anyway, guys, take care. Speak soon.